Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
It was a busy week on Capitol Hill, with House lawmakers advancing spending, defense, and other major legislation before leaving town. What happens next will depend on both the Senate and the agencies responsible for implementation. Here with the latest is Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, great to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
There has been a lot going on up on the Hill this past week. Maybe good news, the House passed its $95 billion Reconciliation 3.0 and a continuing resolution. Let's start there. What's in them? What's controversial?
Well, first of all, you've got about $67 billion for the war with Iran. That inherently is controversial just because there's so much opposition to the war here in Congress, at least from Democrats and from some Republicans. Then you also have within that budget blueprint for Reconciliation 3.0 about $10 billion for so-called election security measures. All those are kind of related to the SAVE Act and what the president has been pushing for. And that's really another huge controversial point because it can't go through the Senate in a conventional way because of the filibuster and the fact that Democrats are not going to support that. But there's also some Republicans, including people like North Carolina's Tom Tillis, who are really skeptical about the fact that they don't think that this reconciliation bill can get passed in time, that you could put in all these election reforms ahead of the midterms. They think it's kind of a pie in the sky type of thing. So it's really put Senate Majority Leader John Thune over a barrel in connection with this. And then the continuing resolution, that was a piece of good news. Of course, we're usually used to hearing about that sometime in the fall, but here we are in the middle of the summer and it gets passed by the House. Surprise, surprise. So it was a good week last week for House Speaker Mike Johnson. However, that doesn't mean it's going to be a nice couple of weeks moving forward here for the Senate, because Senate Majority Leader Thune also has some issues in connection with the continuing resolution that he has to work out with his conference.
Well, and the Senate will be home alone. The House is out of town, so it'll be interesting to see just how the Senate plays this. But another piece of legislation that's stuck between the two chambers, I guess, is the NDAA. The House passed their version. What's the initial take from the Senate side?
Well, the NDAA is kind of stuck right now in the Senate, in part because of the war with Iran. The Democrats held it up recently and said they wouldn't move it forward, even though, as we both know, it's a highly bipartisan piece of legislation in any normal year. So the House, again, proudly says, we have done our job. We have passed it along to the Senate. Now you deal with it. Well, of course, this is another headache for Senate Majority Leader John Thune because the NDAA version of the House has a lot of amendments that were added in, and it's possible that those will be unacceptable to many Democrats as well as some Republicans. Some of the things, as an example of things that were added, were the fact that it would loosen regulations to allow service members and civilian employees to carry firearms on military bases. There's also some changes in connection with TRICARE and the healthcare coverage that would change the regulations and guidelines for gender-related medical procedures. That is always an issue that comes up as sort of a poison pill for Democrats. And then there's the differences just in general terms in connection with military pay. In the House version, it's a staggered pay increase, starting with the lowest enlisted personnel would get about 7%, then goes up to 6% and 5%. In the Senate version, it's a flat 3.6% pay increase for military personnel. So a lot of things still to be worked out in the NDAA side on the Senate side.
And there's talk that they really won't even conference this until after the midterms.
Right. That's another really fascinating thing and frankly troubling to a lot of lawmakers, that this is something that usually, as you know, gets passed 6 decades in a row on time. But because of these differences and a variety of things, and then, of course, the elections themselves, they are not going to get together on this, I don't think, until you're right, until after the midterm elections. So this may be something that goes well deep into at least the start of the next fiscal year.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, let's talk about the dynamics here a little bit. You hinted at it in a couple of places, but the House has tossed some, less than welcome gifts over the fence to their friends in the Senate. How is that playing out, and what does that mean for the dynamics going forward?
There is a bitterness between the lower chamber and the upper chamber. Of course, the House and Senate always have this inherent tension, but here you have the House and the Senate both controlled by Republicans. And what seems to be happening time and time again is that the House has to wrangle with this incredibly tight margin. They only can lose a couple of votes. And to his credit, House Speaker Mike Johnson last week, as I mentioned, got several pieces of significant legislation across the finish line, including, I didn't mention, but a new restrictions on stock trading among lawmakers, which has long been talked about. So once the House gets these passed, they dump them over to the Senate, at least in the view of the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, and then he has to untangle all the different things that his conference don't like. And there's been real signs of tension, not only between the House and the Senate, but now also between the White House and Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Last week, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, said that the patience of the president is running thin in connection with Senate Majority Leader John Thune getting the SAVE Act moved forward. Of course, the president has said this is his top priority. And then on the other side, John Thune said, well, look, if somebody can find me 50 votes on this to get this across the finish line, I'm happy to help. But I have to deal with the math realities here. One, that even if it's a reconciliation bill, if I don't have 50 votes on the Republican side, I can't get it through. And then, of course, if there's anything that's much larger with the Democrats and the filibuster, that's a whole nother story. So he is really feeling, I think, a lot of pressure, not only from the White House, which he's dealt with pretty deftly up to this point, but also I think he's frankly just getting tired of being blamed for everything not going the way that the president wants.
They're even splitting on some really basic policy. The House last week passed another war powers resolution, but the Senate rejected it. So with the White House talking about expanding combat operations, how meaningful are these votes and the disagreements that they reflect?
Well, I was on a call with Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who, as you know, has pushed very hard on these war powers resolutions. The most recent one was actually sponsored by Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen. That was the one that failed last week in the Senate, and then the one in the House, as you mentioned, passed. But basically, Senator Kaine said in addition to continuing to try to get these war powers resolutions brought to the floor and trying to pick up a few more Republican votes, he says the real power is going to be in connection with appropriations for the Defense Department. And he says if the White House continues to effectively ignore what Congress is saying about the war, then he thinks that's when Congress will do what it still can do, which is not appropriate the money for the war and not appropriate these supplemental requests, for example, that the Pentagon and the White House want. So I think that's going to be the next front in this battle between the White House and Congress.
Well, we're anxious to see how it all plays out for sure. As we wrap up here, though, I want to ask you a slightly more wonky question. And this gets to the housing bill that was passed a few weeks ago and enacted without the president's signature. One of the things we're hearing now from Congress is that, yay, we passed the bill, but now we're not sure who's at home in HUD to actually write the implementing regulations. And this is becoming an issue kind of across many departments and flows perhaps out of the DOJ issue, but also out of Loper Bright, the Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago. What are you hearing in conversations on the Hill about not just passing legislation, but actually being able to implement it?
There is a lot of concern related to that because, for example, as you mentioned, you have a housing bill that is widely considered to be the most significant housing bill passed in at least 3 decades. And so, yes, the checkered flag was waved and everybody was happy that it got passed. And of course, then we had the drama with the president actually not signing the bill. But more importantly to your question, does HUD actually have the staffing to get this implemented. I mean, there are a lot of very complicated issues in connection with this legislation. They've changed definitions, for example, related to block grants for low-income housing development. They've changed the standard for manufactured homes and how that would be implemented. And all of this, of course, requires rulemaking and changes to the current law, and it's all part of that legislation. And if you don't have the staffing that can actually crank all that out, it all is going to become moot. And as has been pointed out, the HUD has lost something along the lines of 1,800 personnel just over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a real big issue for something that's a major affordability issue for many Americans. And then just related to some of the DOGE things that have happened, I was recently at a news conference where people that had been fired from USAID and who lost their jobs with the Foreign Service and the State Department. And one of the examples they pointed out is that once they were fired, then ultimately they had to, the agencies had to rehire people to do various things in connection with overseas outreach and a variety of humanitarian programs. And some of the people needed to be trained again to learn new languages. And keep in mind that millions of dollars had been spent already to train these other people who were then fired. So what I'm hearing a lot from lawmakers and from people that have been fired out of the federal government is that the savings just doesn't seem to really be there. It's, cutting your nose off to spite your face, that all of these programs where they initially said they cut a lot of people and they saved a lot of money, they're ending up having to spend more money to get people to replace them.
Sounds like across the board, some chickens may be coming home to roost.
Absolutely.
That's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks as always.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.